storytelling and that kind of aspect. There's lots of interesting games these guys have done. I'm sure some of you have tried these games, like for example the Graveyard and Path and stuff like that. So really interesting to hear. I just told these guys that Media Lab history has had lots of this interactive audiovisual narrative stuff going on, and now even though we have the new game design and production focus area and major nowadays in Media Lab, there's still lots of this history in the storytelling part, so really interesting to hear what these guys have to say. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Of course, we're just telling our point of view on this, but I'm Auriea Harvey, and this is Michaël Samyn, and we're directors and co-founders. Together, we are Tale of Tales. We were invited here to talk about something called subtle storytelling, but we must admit that we've had an ambiguous relationship with stories in our work, and especially with the telling of stories. Since we make non-competitive games, they're always associated with stories, and people call us narrative designers, etc. But storytelling in games has been an issue for us. We don't know if what we do in our games is tell stories. We don't know if that is our work. So anyway, we wanted to give this talk about that issue and how we saw it in the beginning of our career and how we see it now. Okay, that was loud, but not without purpose. You'll find. Although you might want to turn the sound down. Let's see.
Okay, so yes, we're Tale of Tales. In case there's any doubt, we're a couple. We're married, we live together, we work together. Been doing that for about 15 years now. In the beginning we made websites and net art, internet art. And around like 10 years ago we started making video games as Tale of Tales. We've released 7 games in those 10 years as an independent development studio. And yeah, we've been thinking about that since it was our anniversary, and so I realized that even though as a maker of games that aren't really competitive and that aren't really about like fun gameplay, we're often cast in the category of narrative games, but when thinking about our games, it looks like we've never really told a story in our games. Like now we're starting on a game called Sunset, a new project, and it's actually the first game that we're writing a story for, and where a story will be told as you play the game. And it's kind of strange for us to realize that after all this time we're doing this for the first time.
But it does take some explanation to get why we feel this way across. When people think about games, in video games and stories, they often think of cinematic methods of telling stories, cinematic narratives, large cinematic themes, you know. And so a lot of game developers, when they think of story in games, they think of it like a film. We tend to think of stories in games more like this. We're interested in the stories, but we don't consider ourselves writers. And we feel that the art of telling a story is about deepening your sense of the story, to be surrounded by a story. And to us, a cathedral is a perfect sort of metaphor for this. This is a picture of the cathedral in Ghent called St. Bavo's Cathedral. It is famously the house for, or the place where the Ghent altarpiece is kept by the brothers Van Eyck, Jan Van Eyck and Hubert Van Eyck. And often in this type of art, in these type of places, the stories are things that surround you. There's stories you already know or that you know that exist, you know. These types of spaces were made generally for people who were, you know, illiterate and couldn't read the Bible on their own, for example, couldn't read the myths of their own culture on their own. So the stories are told through images, and the story is told through symbolism. So you get all these images involved in a place inside the cathedral that are heavy symbols, like, you know, the Lamb of God bleeding from his heart and all this stuff. Even though we may not know those stories now, we know they are symbolic of those stories. In a cathedral, You are literally surrounded by these stories, and the architecture itself, every ornament, refers to these stories. It's made up of ornaments, it's made up of, very sort of codified symbolic architecture, paintings, sculptures. And to us, this is the kind of environment or the type of situation that better tells a story in an interactive medium. It's also like, this is St. Peter's Cathedral, for example, and on the other side you have a drawing by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who made this extension to St. Peter's, where there's a colonnade that reaches out like the arms of a person to hold you. In that sense, the very design of the space is designed around your body. And often when playing a video game, who hasn't felt completely immersed in the game as such that you project yourself into that space? It's a space where you feel at home and you feel larger by being inside it. In the case of a cathedral, it's also your history. You may feel connected to it, in this case, into a Christian myth. And in that sense, it connects you all the way back, through that myth, all the way back to Adam and Eve. So in this sense, we feel that the linear structure of stories just doesn't feel compatible with video games and the real-time medium. The real-time nature of the medium is something that needs to be experienced, that you need to feel inside, that you are a part of and that you are inside of. And so that is also the way we thought about telling stories. To the extent that in 2006, we wrote a big manifesto that was called the Real-Time Art Manifesto. And it part of it dealt with these issues, because we kind of felt like it was a waste to squeeze the openness of software, this open medium, this nonlinear medium that can be anything, into the rigid format of a linear story. And so, since we also felt like it was a mistake to work with rules-based games, we tried to think of new ways of telling stories within the nonlinear medium. Okay. It was about real-time 3D being a poetic technology.
I'll read a part of it, right? Okay. Can I do this?
Go ahead.
Okay.
You're going to want to use
Okay.
fingers.
All right.
Yeah.
Stories ground people in culture and remove the alienation that causes aggression. They stimulate their imagination and therefore improve the capability to change. They teach them about themselves and connect them with each other. Stories are a vital element of society. This is 2006, right?
Yeah, this is 2006.
Embrace non-linearity. Let go of the idea of plot. Real time is non-linear. Tell the story through interaction. Do not use in-game movies or other non-real-time devices to tell the story. Plot is not compatible with real time. Think poetry, not prose. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle recognized 6 elements in drama. Plot, what happens in a play, the order of events, is only one of them. Next to plot, we have theme, or the main idea in the work. Character, or the personality or role played by an actor. Diction, the choice and delivery of words. Music, rhythm, the sound, rhythm, and melody of what is being said. Spectacle, the visual element of the work. All of these can be useful in non-linear real-time experiences, except plot. But the real-time medium offers additional elements that easily augment or replace plot, like interactivity, the direct influence of the viewer on the work, immersion, the presence of the viewer in the work, and an audience of one. Every staging of the work is done for an audience of a single person in the privacy of his or her home. These new elements add the viewer as an active participant to the experience. This is not a reduction of the idea of story, but an enrichment. Real-time media allow us to tell stories that could not be told before. Many of the mythical fantasies about art can now be made real. Now we can step into paintings and become part of them. Now sculptures can come alive and talk to us. Now we can walk onto the stage and take part in the action. We can live the lives of romance characters, be the poet or the muse. Do not reject storytelling in real time because it is not straightforward. Real-time media allow us to make ambiguity and imagination, active parts of the experience. Embrace the ambiguity. It is enriching. The real-time medium allows for telling stories that cannot be told in any other language. But real-time is not suitable for linear stories. Embrace non-linearity. Reject plot.
So we were trying to, through texts like that, sort of let people know what we were trying to do and what we were trying to do. Wondering if we can get the lights turned down here, but maybe that's possible. So you can see these tiny little movies. Okay, perfect. What we were trying to do was to embrace the medium of video games as we found it and discover and exploit its unique strengths, or what we felt to be their strengths. So these are little movies of our first 4 games. And these video games were based on stories, but never really told them. So I'll have to explain that. But then we went on and made 4 other games that had quite a different focus. And it's where things started to go awry, I guess, for us in this. But just to show you a bit of what those games, all 8 of those games were based on. For example, 8 was based on the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. Number 4 there, The Path, was based also on a fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Number 7, Bientôt l'été, was based on all the novels of Marguerite Duras, a French novelist. And then you have things that were more abstract, like number 2, The Endless Forest, which wasn't really based on any specific story, but in general, the feeling of being a romantic painting, landscape, more about the feeling of the landscape. So we had some very literal stories that we were basing things on, but also things that were more just ideas. And the reason we liked that, I mean, not only because we called ourselves Tale of Tales, was because people like stories. We may not have wanted to or been reluctant to tell them, but people like stories, and ultimately so do we. We're fascinated by stories, and especially old stories like the fairy tales and myths that we've chosen. We like them for those same reasons that I was saying that video games are like cathedrals, because stories connect us to our past and to each other in culture. So many of the stories are very old, but they cross country borders and connect us all. And I think that Michaël and I have always felt in our career as digital media artists that we need, now more than ever, ways of connecting each other and to feel connected between people, connections between people. Yeah. And between the two of us. We'll
Yeah, we met each other on the internet, and so connection was like an important thing. Yeah. But also both of us, even independently of each other, started working with the internet as our artistic medium, mainly because we could reach our audience directly through it. We didn't need galleries, we didn't need publishers, we didn't need anybody to take our work and present it to somebody. We could do that ourselves. So even when we stopped making work directly on the internet, that element of digital production remained very important. Should we show a bit of the older work?
Let's see what we got here. Right. So, for example, these are very, very old projects. These are things that we made in the late 90s, early 2000s, before we started making video games. What we liked about the internet was that you created on the same medium that you delivered it on, and then people also were able to connect you through it. So it's like the web seemed ideal for us. To the point where, like Michaël said, we met online, and this was the first project that we made together, which was a project called Skin on Skin on Skin. And it was actually a series of love letters between the two of us, where we sent, he would send me an image, and a page, an interactive, animated, possibly sonified even, page, and then I would send him a response. But it was always about this desire to sort of reach through the computer and touch one another. So for example, this one is something very simple. He takes a tracing of his hand and sends me the JPEG. And then I take a tracing of my hand, place it on top. We were in 2 different countries and didn't know if we were ever going to meet. So to us, the internet and digital media in general had this effect of being something more than talking to one another, something more than just sending an email or talking on the telephone. It was something where we could become fantasies for each other, where we could emulate each other. So, for example, in the image of me, I sent him something where if you mouse over it, my head turns from side to side, so it's almost like he's controlling my head. So then he does the same thing, only he's outside in the snow. It's like, what does that say poetically, is sort of the idea. Later, we sort of developed more serious software for this type of communication after we got together even. And we did a weekly performance called Wirefire on our website, entropy8super.org. I should have printed that on the slide. Sorry about that. But Wirefire was something we did every Thursday night for, I don't know how many years, from like 1999 to 2003, every week. And people online could come and witness this performance, which was actually sort of like VJing. We had all these like images and sounds and animated files and even text chats that we could have.
But you have to explain that each of us had their own
Yeah.
folder, and we didn't know of each other what was in the folder. So
Right.
every time we did a performance, it was a sort of a communication and a surprise for each other, and often also a way for us to continue talking about something that was difficult to talk about in words, in text, sometimes very personal things. And we were a little exhibitionistic, I guess. We let people watch our strange conversations.
Yeah. And then occasionally, like, we'd put up a box and people could type to us. So it was also participatory with the audience a little bit, but mainly it was our show, and it was sort of like an opera a week or something. But, okay, so for a long time, our work was kind of just about ourselves, I guess that's to say, like a lot, especially when we were working on the internet. When we started working with games, we really, even before that, we knew that the things, that our artwork couldn't just be autobiographical, we couldn't just be a conversation, even though we liked that kind of storylessness. But now we feel like not only we have changed, but the world has changed. And when we're confronted every day, you know, with images of unrest, with images of people's struggles, you know, we start to wonder about the place of stories and culture once again, and how those stories are told through the medium of video games. And since we don't want to make up a casual causal change to explain reality, we want to explore it as we found it without attempting to explain it. We feel like art is about questioning and about wondering about things like this. And then the media of video games, it becomes a way of exploring it even further and even deeper. I'd say that we've done this before in our work. Many of our games have explored the stories that they have in an attempt to figure out what they could mean beyond conventional interpretations. So this is The Path, where it was a game about growing up, but it wasn't always like it wasn't taking one view of that growing up as a woman. It was taking several different views and trying to present them all, and then ultimately it is whatever you felt it was, I guess. All interpretations being correct. So the interactive medium gives us a tool to look at things from many different angles. The art doesn't need to have a message anymore, not one specific message that, you know, we're didactically trying to impart into your brains. And so it's the task of the player to draw conclusions about what they're doing in the game and about what they're seeing in the game. We've dealt with a lot of tough subjects, but it's going to get tougher, and this is another scene referring to our new game, Sunset, because we're dealing even more with what we feel are the tough subjects that are involved in living in the world today. Okay, now we're going to tell you a little bit about how we've dealt with story previously, so that we can tell you how we want to deal with story in the future, I guess.
Yeah, no, I can talk about this. Yeah, just to introduce, this is this is a slide about a very first project called 8, which was an exploration of the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty, which I note here down is like Prinsessa Rusunen or something in Finnish. In any case, we were very fascinated by this particular story, but we had no interest to actually tell it. So what we did was we sort of added an extension to the story. In our version of 8, the princess doesn't wake up, stays asleep in her mausoleum. The forest grows more and more and overgrows the whole palace where she sleeps. Everybody remains asleep, and the game itself takes place in contemporary times, and you discover this place, but not alone. Maybe, yeah. So, yeah. Do you want to go down this thing? Okay.
All right. So, in our version of the game, because sort of based on all the things we were reading you about our ideas about not having plot, also, there was no text in the game because we felt like language separates people. We didn't want to make a game that was just in one language, but that could speak to everyone. There was no conventional gameplay or HUD or anything like that. This is in 2002 that we were coming up with this idea, and we just felt like because of the way that we came into wanting to make video games, which was not because we had played video games our entire lives, but because we started playing video games and then saw so much potential in it. We sort of were always playing video games and wondering, asking all these questions about why games were the way they were, and the only way we could answer those questions for ourselves was to make a game. And we felt like gameplay in most video games sort of got in the way of the things that we felt were beautiful about them. Put long story short. In 8, that you play the game with an autonomous character, that little girl who remains sort of nameless. She was also silent. She was a deaf-mute girl. She was autonomous character, meaning that you weren't her. She wasn't your avatar. You played the game with her and discovered things in this world with her. The whole game was a real-time 3D environment, which also, believe it or not, was odd at the time for something that they kept terming an adventure game. But we were very into 3D and sort of insisted on wanting that situation for the player. We wanted to create a world where the player cared about this main character as if you were her parent. So we were trying to evoke a lot of emotions in the game, like the girl might be in danger or something and you had to sort of always protect her. So the fairy tale was just an experience, a background noise for the experience of being in this beautiful world with a character that you cared about. Our personal enjoyment of video games is in worlds, characters, and atmosphere. So we wanted to focus on those and not on some external mechanic. We didn't want to make a platform game. We didn't want to make even a traditional adventure game, which back then was very much about pointing and clicking and solving very sort of obscure puzzles. Instead, we wanted to get rid of the baggage from all of this sort of what we felt was left over from arcade games and to make something that was very new. And it definitely was new at the time because we had no obstacles, no enemies, no puzzles. So there were not a lot of opportunities in the video games industry and in the video games medium at that time. So it seemed like we were being very rebellious. But when we felt there was just a lot of unexplored territory in video games, and we wondered why people weren't taking advantage of it. Eventually, we tried to figure out how we were going to make it, and we were very serious about making it a commercial project. So we formed Tale of Tales, and we thought we were going to be a big game studio and hire 30 people and all this sort of stuff. But what we learned was that we're very bad managers. And we also learned the system of arts funding, which it turned out was one of the only reliable ways that we could get money to make this game at the time for various reasons. We realized that making games was a full-time job, so we stopped making other work for clients and focused on this full-time. But back then, this concept of being an independent game designer, developer, or game studio just wasn't even a thing yet. So it was a bit risky for us to do that, and we sort of started working within the auspices of the Jan van Eyck Academy, which is a postgraduate research facility in Maastricht. And so that kind of helped us to do this full-time as well. We created prototypes and we had testing sessions and all this sort of stuff. We went to game conferences, we learned about the industry, we talked to publishers, we got close to deals, but ultimately, even though we made connections and things, our game was rejected because it was genreless and had no combat, and ultimately because it had no story also. But we remember one publisher rejecting it because he said that there was no combat or melee in the game, and that was just funny to think about now. But the overall lesson was that that we had, even though it was rejected sort of for financial reasons by the games industry at large, was that telling stories via experience and environment was a viable thing to do. And I think that we've been sort of justified now, proven right now, in that there are so many games, even successful ones, financially successful ones, who do this stuff today. So. Turned it down, my sound effect. Okay, so.
All right, yeah. So we worked for 2 years on this project 8. As a, we were not new to digital creation or making art, but we were very new to games. So it's sort of not a surprise in a way that it didn't work out. But we did learn a lot, and I think it was kind of crucial for how we continued working later. Like Auriea said, we discovered the existence of arts funding for these kinds of things, which was not a given at the time. There was a fund in Belgium that gives grants for making film, and they had a sort of section called experimental media. So we emailed them and said, hey, we experiment, and then we explained, yeah, we make video games, we have funding for that, and they immediately sent a message back, no, we don't do that, we don't fund video games. And so we started begging and said, but please, it's not what you think, blah, blah, blah. So we went there with our PC under our arm and literally showed these people what we were working on back then. And then they allowed us to submit a proposal, etc. And ever since then, we've sort of been able to work with funding, mostly funded from this particular film fund, actually. But they're always very tiny sums of money. And so that has quite seriously influenced the kinds of work we were making. And the thing is, we don't regret it. We kind of, because it felt a bit like working before, like making websites was also very small, etc. It wasn't exactly that small anymore, never any again. But so for our next project, we wanted to make an MMO, just like mistake number 2 if you're independent developer, but we had a plan, because what we thought, we had a big, design idea to make this game, but we knew we weren't going to be able to fund this because it was weird, etc. So what we said, okay, let's just boil it down to its very, very essence, this particular game. What do we need to make something that we can actually finish and put out there and have people play? Because that was our goal. We really wanted to show people what we were making instead of just talking about it. So that's how the Endless Forest started, as a very small, non-commercial thing.
We made it through arts funding in the beginning, very, very small, like arts grants. So then we also had to come up with other ways of expanding the world. But like Michael said, it was very small in the beginning. You were a deer in a forest, and you could do a couple of things, and that was it. And we put it online and said, hey, okay, there it is, It was, however, a multiplayer game. So it's like we didn't actually think that people would really play it. It was almost like we were, since 8, they said we were being rebellious by doing all these strange things. We sort of took that to heart and said, okay, well, you want to see rebellious, we'll show you rebellious. We'll make this game that has no quests, it's got no competition, it's got no violence, it's got no chatting. And this is like taking the idea of a multiplayer environment and putting it on its head. And not only that, but you're a deer. So, we were like, well, deer don't chat, But also, we didn't like the idea of chatting any more than we liked the idea of there being actual language in the game, because we felt like that separated people from each other. Chatting, we felt, if you remember, or I don't know when the last time was you played in MMO, but often there's a lot of people who are not role-playing, and they're just running around and saying a lot of really silly things. And also, because a lot of young people play these games, they tend to hurt each other, or there's a lot of friction within the community. So we were like, well, you're a deer, you can't chat anyway, so we gave people other activities to do, like rubbing a tree, or eating mushrooms from a tree, Or does it just jumping, for example, going to sleep in a circle of mushrooms. We were thinking of forest things. In addition to that, because you're there with each other, people had this tendency to make up a lexicon of these body language actions that we gave them and make a language out of that. And so we felt a bit justified in this, in doing this, and also because people tended to like this sort of beautiful atmosphere where it was a game where you were just running through a forest. I mean, as silly as it sounds now, it's like, or just talking about it, that's the point, is that it was so silly, and that you can't play the game without laughing. You can't play the game without feeling like you are a part of this forest that isn't even real. So we tried to embed story in the environment in the sense that we gave landmarks, like this image, which is very small, but there's like a ruin there, for example. There's a big oak tree that you can go inside. There's a lake, a pond that you can go stand beside. We also embedded magic into the world that you have to discover. Since you can't talk about it, people can show it to you by you following people around and seeing what they do. And also we created the system where the magic in the forest can't be used on yourself, but only on another player. And in this way, it encourages the playing between the people in the game.
Yeah, the magic involves customizing the character, which is kind of a basic thing. In MMO, you want to change the way your character looks. But in the Endless Forest, you can't do that yourself. You need another player to do that. They have to eat a magical mushroom, whatever, and then they get the magical spell. Then they can cast it on you. Yeah. And there's a lot. I mean, the background image, you can't see it, but there's a lot of people who make a game out of that particular thing, where they try to look with like 10 or 20 deer. They all try to look the same. But since the spell that you get from these trees and from all the things you need to do are given randomly, it takes an enormous amount of effort. It's like they're designing their own grind or something. Yeah. But they enjoy this. They make up these games.
But the important thing is that all of that is completely optional. I mean, and so for people to take the effort to do all these things and to make up their own games is something that we find quite fascinating. The only thing that we truly sort of lead in the game ourselves is that Michaël and I can appear in the game world and make things happen that don't ordinarily happen. Like we can make it rain, we can make there be explosions of flowers in the world, we can make big rainbows appear across the sky, dramatic lightning, things of that nature. And we used to have lots of parties in the forest where we would invite all the people who were playing to come at a specific date and time, and there would be like huge environmental extravaganzas that we would put on that we called abiogenesis parties. We don't do this anymore. The game has been online since 2005, and it'll probably be online until, I don't know, until we run out of money or get sick of hosting it. But I mean, there's no reason to take it off. I mean, I think the reason that we like the Endless Forest as developers is that it's a world that we've made that is there whether we are there or not, that it exists whether we are there or not. And that as long as people come there and play, it is real. So no story, I'm not sure. People, as we said, make up their own stories and games about the game world sort of spontaneously, and they write this stuff down. There's fan fiction about the Endless Forest. There's tons of fan art that has been made over the years. There are people who are really into the idea of being an animal in a forest, and we provided a place for those people, and that's pretty great, actually. As a creator, you kind of are happy that you've provided something that no one else is providing for a group of people. And especially young people, parents tend to like the Endless Forest because it's sort of a safe place for their kids to come and play without the chat, without feeling like someone is sort of preying on them or something. So, yeah, the Endless Forest is pretty cool.
Yeah, graveyard. The graveyard was somewhat of an exercise for us to see how far we could take our kind of minimalist spirit, in the sense of taking away the obstacles towards enjoyment of games, what we enjoyed in games, and to see how little we need to actually have a nice experience. So it's a very simple game. You play an older woman who visits a graveyard. There's a straight path towards a bench that's next to a little chapel, and the entire game consists of walking towards that bench and sitting down on the bench and listening to some music that plays while you sit down. We have a movie of this somewhere. Yeah. So from the Endless Forest, we sort of learned this idea of putting that what matters to us was not so much the story or what exactly you did, but that you could pretend or imagine to be a certain character in a certain situation. And that's sort of all we wanted to design, the character and the situation, and everything else was sort of up to the player. So I should say one more thing. This is our first commercial game, in the sense that there's two versions of it. The version that I described is available for free, but for $5, you can buy the chance of the woman dying while she sits on the bench listening to the music. This was inspired by real life. Yeah, it's actually not funny in a way, because one of the inspirations for the main character is my grandmother, who is now dead, was an extremely Catholic woman. Her husband had died, and she very deeply believed that when she died, she would just go and join him in heaven. So she was absolutely fearless. She had no problem with the idea of dying. In fact, she was sort of, when we visited her in the apartment, she said, "Do you want this vase when I'm dead? I work at her table now," because she gave this to me when she was still alive. She had, and we were so in awe of her, how easy she found it to this idea of death, that this influenced this design. Another aspect was sort of a childhood memory of mine, or teenager memory, where I went to a cemetery in my hometown in Izegem. That was actually quite similar to the design in the game. It was also sort of like a grid and a bit like a city, but instead of blocks of houses, there were graves. There were people there, but they were dead. But overall, there was plants growing everywhere, and there were birds everywhere, and it was very calm and sort of a soothing atmosphere. It wasn't grim or gloomy at all. And this contrast between death and life was another sort of part of inspiration. And I say all these things because all these things are sort of like elements that we find very interesting to make games with, that are not stories at all. They're just, things that exist, real life. Sure.
I don't know.
Van het jaar 8 tot het jaar 40, ja die Irma was nog jong. Het was een Duitser met de tering, te groot hart, te zwakke long. René, die had een vleesboom, tante Mo is in haar slaap, doodgevallen in een droom. En nooit meer opgeraapt. Kijk, dan is Emma doodgeboren, zie dat je er niet overloopt. Haar portret al lang verloren, een blauw kruisje nooit gedoopt. En Roger, dat was de
I play this song because it's hard to read the subtitles, but if you read them, they deal with a lot of the themes in the game. And so a lot of the criticism that we got from the game was that the story of the game was completely told through the song. But we often also get like people who love the game who say, no, the story was told in their mind. It reminded them of their grandmother, not just through the song, but through the interaction, through having to move this old woman sort of painfully down the sidewalk to get to the bench, to have her sit down, and then to finally have her sit there and to wonder, will she live or will she die? And that this was kind of an emotional thing for people to see this and to feel embodied in this way. So it was, to us, a successful story told, because we wanted people to give people that feeling and not so much to tell the story that is in the song. The song really only plays for some time to pass, and for that pay for death moment, like will she live or will she die her natural death sitting there. So yeah, this was a very interesting project for all of those reasons. Also because it was because of that personal aspect also. But then we moved on and made the path. We actually made the graveyard sort of in between while we were working on the path, we took a break and made the graveyard, kind of, as Michael said, it being our first commercial experiment to see if people would actually buy anything from us. And they did, which surprised the heck out of us. And also because the path was taking so long, it was such a big project. It took 3 years to develop that game. And so it had a lot of other sort of story issues going on in it that were where the graveyard sort of proved as
a little bit, though.
I will,
Okay, so
as a sort of proving ground for those things. The Path is our game that's based on Little Red Riding Hood, and it has these 6 girls, and each one of them Red Riding Hood. They range in age from 9 to 19, and you have to take each of them through the forest, and the story is either told or not told. I should explain first about the idea of the mechanics of the game, which had a lot more to do with this idea of control versus non-control. As you take each girl through the forest to grandmother's house, you are not always in control of her. You have to leave this path and then go through the forest, and you find things there, things that have a certain narrative resonance, we hope. And in order to interact with those objects, you have to let go of the girl and let her do whatever she's going to do with that item. And that leads to a very uneasy feeling, perhaps, of a loss of control and desiring to do something and failing to do it. And all of these things are themes of the game and of that story that we were trying to emulate without telling it. We also, I had a little video for that. We also made it a horror game because we feel like horror is easy. Horror games, you just make things kind of dark and creepy.
Well, especially easy for artists, for a non-artistic audience. I mean, it's so easy, for contemporary people who are not accustomed to contemporary art to be completely freaked out by a work of art. So if you make a video game and you put your artwork in a horror context, people accept it because they want to be freaked out. Yeah. So that's why it's easy.
Everything is unknown. So the story is told through the game rules, and the player tells and retells the story by just being there and being creeped out.
Yeah, but only in a kind of a rudimentary fashion. I mean, the story basically there's one rule in the game, one rule and one goal in the game. The goal is go to grandmother's house, and the rule is don't go off the path, stay on the path, which we took directly from the fairy tale. But other than that, there's not a lot of imposition. Every girl, every Red Riding Hood finds their particular wolf in the forest if they go off the path, if they break the one rule that they're supposed to follow as gamers, if it were a game.
Yeah, so if you want to
and
win,
then
you
if
have
you
to fail.
if you did that and you reach your goal, grandmother's house, then just like in the story, the wolf had been there before you, and you die. So in the end, that room here with the 6 girls is empty. That's the end of the game.
But suffice it to say, this whole thing, as convoluted as it may have sounded, if you haven't played the game, and I suggest you do, this game was actually commercially successful for us. In fact, it's outside of the Endless Forest, which just has crazy numbers of players. The most people who know our work know us through the path. And I think it was that successful experimentation and playing with people's expectations of game rules that made it a successful game that resonated with a lot of people. Yeah. So we got all optimistic, and then very soon after releasing The Path, we made another game called Fatal, which is based on the myth of Salome, which, I'll just go out and say it. We felt really optimistic, and so we felt free to experiment. And the one problem with that was that was maybe a little bit selfish, and we weren't thinking about our players quite enough. And because we wanted to tell this story but it was based on kind of an obscure story about a Jewish princess who dances for the king and is offered anything she wants in return, and so she asks for the head of John the Baptist.
But we didn't know it was obscure.
We didn't know it was obscure.
We thought it was really famous.
We thought it was like this very famous story. However, that turned out to be not something that everyone knew. And especially since we were dealing with it with the text that was written by Oscar Wilde, who is a very well-known author. However, most people kind of just know little quips and they haven't actually read Oscar Wilde's plays. So we were a bit like sort of...
This is where we
thrown
ran
off
into
from that.
trouble with our idea of we don't want to tell stories, we just want to explore a story that
Yeah.
already exists, which is always based on the assumption that the people who play the game know the story, and in this case they didn't, not so much.
So we made this game where, as I said, Salome, after dancing, asks for the head of John the Baptist, and you play John the Baptist in the game. So the first thing that happens is your head gets cut off, and you spend the rest of the game sort of floating as a spirit. And the game is actually an exploration of that entire story, but in the aftermath of that story. So we were trying to we sort of took it one step too far in that we were telling a story the way a painting tells a story. Is like sort of this rejection of cinematic storytelling and just wanting to make the world very still. And throughout the game, you were putting out all these lights and getting bits of text in spoken word. And now we recently updated the game so there's actually words on the screen that act as subtitles that are from Oscar Wilde's play. The game is also full of anachronisms. Like Salome has an iPod, things like this that we felt sort of, what we were hoping to do was to tie the world, this imaginary world, with the world that we have today. Lots of reasons why we decided to do that. But it also, the biggest problem that people had was the emotional ambiguity of the game. Like we didn't tell there was no specific emotion we were going for other than sort of, I don't know.
Offering the opportunity to John the Baptist to fall in love with Salome. Which was ours, again, sort of an extension to the story. Especially in Oscar Wilde's version of this story, the princess is in love with the prophet. But this prophet is so sort of high on religion that he says, "No, you vile creature, basically he has no time for love, I guess, and he doesn't like her and her family, and there's some kind of incest going on, etc. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it almost feels like Salome said, "You know what? I'm going to just chop your head off, and then I'm going to kiss you," which is what she does in the play. And so he said, "Yeah, but what? Give this guy a second chance, because he's a prophet. It's his job to act like that. And maybe now that he's dead, he'll give him some time, one final night in our game to explore what happened, and maybe think about the possibility of finding Salome beautiful in some way."
So it was through the act of not telling the story and assuming that people knew it, but then adding our own thing to it, which is what we've always done with all of our narratives that we've sort of picked apart.
Grammar error.
Grammar error. Oh yeah, only its after effects are seen in the game for the typo. But anyway, this was not what we felt to be a successful project because nobody got it, even though a lot of people think it's very beautiful and everything. And so it was kind of odd, and it's an oddity in everything we do. And after that, we made something even more obscure called Vanitas, in which there's no game, no story, and only a theme. It was our first iPhone game or a mobile game for mobiles, where it's sort of on this sort of theme of 18th century paintings, you might say, or before, still life paintings, where you see objects that relate to the subject of death. Anyway, the way that we told story in this was also, it's definitely not story-based. We had lots of quotes. So it's like there's a box that you see on your phone. You open the box, you close the box. And then every time you open it, there's 3 objects in it. But you also get quotations from like this one that says, "Man cannot do what he wants. Man can do what he wants, but he cannot want what he wants." So it's sort of like these, you're being asked to meditate on these themes of futility, It's a memento mori. There's like, yeah, it's very. It puts you in a position. Yeah, lots of quotes.
All
Yeah.
these quotes.
So there's other quotes like, I have seen
So
all the works
we
that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity
Yeah,
and
read them
chasing
all.
after wind. No, not all of them.
I was just going to say that since it was sort of our first game for iPhone, we were kind of weirded out by the whole cell phone revolution, I must say, and especially the iPhone was like this kind of luxury item in our eyes, and people were, I don't know, not even realizing how luxurious it was, this thing, and so we wanted to sort of, I don't know, I guess, remind people of the reality of our lives and the fragility of it, and sort of the depth of it, you know, how beautiful it is in a way. I think that's the reason why Baroque painters made these paintings of skulls and butterflies and all these things, sort of to say people, hey, life, it's not gonna be forever. It's kind of fragile and things change all the time. Better pay attention, you know. I guess in a way, don't be on your phone all the
Don't be on
time.
your phone all- yeah.
So it became a very meditative piece. So every time you open the lid, 3 objects appear, but you didn't know which ones, and you close it again, and there's a number on the cover that counts every time you open and close it, and it's 3 different objects every time. And all you could, it's sort of you move your phone and the objects roll it. So that's all you could do, move them around a little bit. And there's only one thing, sort of program thing that happens, is that if it happened that you have 3 identical objects, then you're rewarded. You get a gold star on the cover of your little box.
And you're asked to consider how lucky you are to have that star. So as you can see, like, our games are getting more and more. I think that after The Path, it was such an intense game to make that we were sort of trying to have some fun with all this stuff. So we made Fatal, and that was completely misunderstood. And then we made Vanitas, and people got it, but they were a little bit like, what, you know? So then we go off and we make our next game.
No.
There's a man on T Beach. Or a woman. I don't know, I'll decide later. The man is alone. There is wind and waves and sky. And the man, or the woman, he closes his eyes, the glowing energy of machines. What? This is not real? He opens his eyes, looks around and around again. Then he walks. Or she. And the gulls fly away. The beach is endless. Everything disappears, becomes fluid, becomes immense. We are lost in space, looking for a man or a woman to talk to, in French, if possible. Far away, nearly summer. Our game Bientôt l'été is based on a lot of real novels by Marguerite Duras. Michael read them all. In French.
Yeah, but it's been a lifelong fascination. I really adore Marguerite Duras' work. And at some point, one of the peculiarities about her work is that she uses a sort of a very minimal language, which is especially striking in conversations between people. They will say, you know, one character will say one thing and the other will say another thing, and it doesn't often doesn't feel like an exact reaction to what they said, but together they sort of build this kind of poem almost, and it reminded me a lot of sort of random text generation by computers in a way. So that's sort of the first trigger for wanting to do something with the conversations in Marguerite Duras in a computer context as a piece of software. And the other part, I guess, is sort of memories of the beach. I grew up very close to the beach in Belgium, and this you know, the experience of that environment, combined with knowing that Marguerite Duras lived near the beach for a very long time in her life, and that appeared in her work a lot as a sort of symbol of things. And then we put it in space.
But I think that the deal was that we wanted to give people the feeling and the effect of that the art has on us, and not so much try to recreate someone else's artwork, you know? So it's like, we wanted to deal with the effects again, the effects of those words more so than we wanted to deal with the words themselves. And so this game was also misunderstood by many. I'll just say that.
I don't. What am I doing? I don't. Oh. What the? What? What's going on? Oh God. Dude. What? I don't. Am I not allowed to look
in
that
a way,
way?
proving that horror is easy because this guy's completely
Okay, I'm not gonna look
scared
that
of
way anymore.
everything.
Let's just
He's
walk
just
over
like, what am
here.
I doing? Oh my God, I'm walking.
Sometime.
But this,
There's hundreds of these on YouTube.
yeah, if you go search for Bientôt
Why do you
l'été
keep on
on
doing
YouTube,
that?
yeah, you get a lot of this reaction. We thought people would just sort of take it as it's given. Okay, nice
'Cause
experience.
it's a very easy game to play. I
Okay.
mean, it's not
I'm
nearly as
sorry, I'm
hard as
freaking out.
most
I don't know
other
what's
games.
going on.
You
Why is
walk
there a
along the
bench here?
beach, you see words, you go and play some chess in a
I
cafe.
don't
You know,
what's
it's all
going
very
on.
simple, and yet people
Alright,
looking for
I'm
fun
walking.
are
Let's just,
completely
I guess,
complex and
teleport
couldn't
over
deal with
there.
it, and we ended up with a lot of reactions like this, which made us sad,
I
very,
can
very
see
sad, unspeakably
clearly
sad.
now the rain has
Yeah.
fallen. I hope I
So
don't
you can
get-
imagine how we felt after this. After this, we sort of decided to change our entire philosophy around, like, because we had been dealing with like sort of environmental storytelling and the effects of those stories and things like that for so long that we were kind of like, okay, well, apparently sometimes this is very hit or miss for us, and when it misses badly. And while we still love those games, and there are a lot of people who got a lot out of Bientôt l'été or even Fatal, we felt that we weren't communicating to the extent that we wanted to. To us, our games are very easy and very easy to enjoy. And so we were like, well, maybe this is a design problem. So we developed, if the first games in the first 10 years of our development experience was covered by our manifesto of the Realtymark Manifesto, then we needed a new sort of philosophy, and that became the Beautiful Art Program, which the URL is not on the screen, but oh well. Okay.
Find it. Well, no, I'm not going to go over it, but sort of more in general. As artists, we feel sort of a responsibility to give beauty to people. And beauty has been kind of a subject that has been more or less vilified throughout modernist history. We don't have a problem, we don't have any allegiance with modernism, so we're happy to embrace non-modernist subjects in our work. But we feel it's just very important. For us, this is a political thing. We really believe that people need beauty in their lives. And I guess maybe that's a transition. First it was story, now it's beauty. Yeah. It's similar though in some cases. So we felt, even though we feel our work is beautiful and very easy to enjoy, and a small group of people agrees with that, we felt that we were sort of not taking up our responsibility sufficiently because we weren't reaching out enough. We weren't, especially given the fact that we use video games as a medium, which is a medium that is potentially very accessible and can be distributed really easily. So what we wanted to do, and that's a decision we made after sort of thinking about that after 10 years of work, is that we wanted to try a lot harder and be, I guess, like be less selfish, make work less for ourselves, and really work towards helping players enjoy our work. And this involves a lot of sort of sacrifice to some extent, but on the other hand, it still feels noble, because to us, it feels a bit like what they used to say, I guess, the entertaining people, in the sense of, inviting them to your house, and you're the host, and you make a pleasant atmosphere. I think that's sort of what we want to do next.
Yeah, so since we wrote the Beautiful Art program and sort of took all of these things to heart, like sort of 10 guidelines for making our next 10 years of games, the first thing we released since writing that was Luxuria Superbia, and I'll show you. So what it looks like is what it is. Very simple, casual game for tablets and PCs and consoles. We made it, first thing was to make the game accessible, to make it so that everyone could play it no matter what hardware they had. Also to make something that could be played socially. You can play it with more than one person. You can have multiple people touching the screen. You can play it on consoles with up to 4 game pads and everyone's playing together. But what are they doing? They're touching and things are exploding on the screen, and but the idea is not that it explains itself right away. The idea is that it's something that people can pick up and play and enjoy, because what they're actually doing is something that has to do with this. Luxuria Superbia is a game based on sex. It is a game that is not based on sex in the sense of 2 avatars getting it on and looking all awkward and you having this really bad uncanny valley effect. Luxuria Superbia is based on sex as it exists in your mind, as it exists in your heart and your body as you're doing it. It is a game where we literally thought about how the flow of sex is very game-like in and of itself, and can we develop a way to get people to play the game and have those same sort of feelings or ideas in their head about this, yet still make something that is sociable and fun. A lot of people do say that they're embarrassed when they play it, but we get a wider range of responses to the game than we've had from any other game that we've made, actually. Sometimes, anyone who picks up the game and plays it sort of immediately gives us this look like, oh, I know what this is. And it's not something that I can stand here and explain why you automatically know what it is. It's something that as you're playing it, the experience of playing it explains itself, you might say.
The structure is very recognizable.
Yeah, the structure is very recognizable.
It's basically you sort of have to touch the game and it responds to you, but if you touch it too fast, then it stops. And so you quickly learn that you have to sort of give a little bit and then take back, and then it's very familiar.
Yeah. So the thing we wanted to say with this slide, though, is that even though the game is successful in terms of what it communicates, which isn't a story, and which in this case was not what we were going for anyway, was a story, except for the story of an orgasm. It's sort of successful, and even though it's successful in the sense that people enjoy the game, it's still not successful in the sense that we reached a huge audience and became the next Rovio or something. Although it would have been really amusing to become the next Rovio with a game about sex. We did a game about sex because we felt like it was unexplored territory. Just like all the other games that we made, we felt like this is something that hasn't been explored in a game. And in this case, we made something that was socially acceptable, even given the subject matter. But our instincts somewhere are still wrong about things because we can't reach the audience that we want to reach, or we can't reach a large enough audience with our games. So since we never wanted to be elitist artists, and since we kind of feel like, well, maybe our original instincts are our first instincts about how we are making games or whatever, telling stories in games, are wrong, we decided to try a different tactic. Is that a good way of putting it? I don't know. More or less.
No, that's
So-
true. I mean, you know, we had our program. We wanted to live up to it. And the difference being that we made Luxury Superbia very intuitively, and it turned out to be wrong. So our next project is not so intuitive. We did a lot of research for shall we? Yeah. This is, we just started this project, so, but it's a very strange one because, like we mentioned in the beginning, this is the first game that we actually write a story for, and the reason is not that we suddenly want to tell stories. The reason is actually that we did research, we talked to players, we read a lot of things, and we came to the conclusion that even in games that don't, I mean, it's sort of like basically it boiled down to, if you make a game that doesn't have conventional gameplay in the sense of challenges and rewards and all that, you have to have a story. And even if your game doesn't have one, people are going to look for one. And so we sort of said, okay, you know, you need a story, we'll write one. So it's sort of like we're using story as a means to an end. We still want to give people that kind of experience of beauty and really exploring certain subject, but apparently they need some kind of structure to be able to do that. We feel kind of frustrated by that as designers. We would like to go a little bit further and be more serious about our medium, but in the end, it's more important for us that we can give people a bit of joy and an opportunity to feel something, to think about something, etc. So that's how we come to storytelling, and we don't do this on our own. We write this together with another person who helps us write the story. The things that you've seen at the top of this whole like 44 plot point 3-act structure, we just adopted that from some Hollywood scripting software. All those things we work with an agency of Lee Alexander and Steve Curran, who sort of help us, guide us towards, sort of make the link between, if we have ideas, they can tell us like, will this work for people who are used to more conventional games? Will they be able to get into it, etc., etc. So it's kind of constantly double checking our own ideas. It's
I mean, would you say it's more like we're caring more about what the audience, what their experience is in the end, and how they feel about the game?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I said, it's
more like
sort of
that.
like entertaining guests. We want to create a nice atmosphere where people can
Yeah.
have a nice experience. And it's just weird for us because this doesn't come natural to us.
Yeah, I think in a way we see the telling of a traditional narrative, a narrative, a cliche narrative. I'll just break it down like that. 3-act structure, high points, low points. We see that as a game mechanic almost. Maybe this is going to end up being another one of our mistakes, but it's almost like the game is the story in Sunset. The story is the game. And
yeah, I can
through
explain that.
finding it.
What we wanted to make originally was, we wanted to have, it's actually based on a very old idea. It's an empty apartment. You play a housekeeper, and you go to this apartment once a week during when the sun sets. An hour before sunset, you arrive, and it's empty. Your task is to clean up. You get a bunch of tasks. You clean up, and through the way that you do these tasks, you develop a sort of communication with the owner of the apartment. And this develops more and more into sort of flirtations, and it becomes romantic. And as the passion increases of your relationships, bombs start going outside. There's like a big city that you can see through the window, and the whole thing starts like exploding and fire. And it's in the end, when the passion is really intense, the whole city is on fire, and it's a war zone basically, with airplanes and helicopters, apocalypse now, all that kind of stuff. And then we said, people are not going to get this. And then we invented a story to justify this whole thing, a whole story about revolution and oppressive governments and what have you. It's interesting. The thing is that it becomes interesting in and of itself because we decided to set it in Latin America. In 1972 we chose, and now we sort of get to explore that entire era. We decided to make the main character black, so this is the period of the Black Panther movement, and so we can explore that whole thing, that the atmosphere that Auriea grew up in the United States, and that kind of rebellion against authority. So it remains this kind of exploring a story in a way for us, as in terms of production. So it's not like we're doing this reluctantly. We're still having a lot of fun making this game.
And I think tackling a subject like revolution and treating it seriously, but not at the same time being like, oh, you're going to play at war, you know, but to make you a character who's just trying to get on with their lives and becomes embroiled in something larger than themselves is something that we feel like can speak to a lot of people today. I mean, if you look at the world, there's a lot of unrest and war and everything, but we're here in this room in Finland talking about video games. And that's kind of a conundrum, at least for us, because we feel like we're living in some sort of fantasy world in this sense, where the world just keeps on turning, but at any minute, you know, reality can come crashing down and the world can change in a blink of an eye, and suddenly war is at your doorstep. I guess that's the thing. So we wanted to give people kind of this same, to make this feeling real for people, to make them realize that this is what you're living, you know, even though you get up in the morning and you go on and you do whatever it is you do with your day, you know, that somewhere somebody is standing looking out their window of their apartment and bombs are falling. So, yeah, we wanted something to tell the story that is somewhere in between all of those things. And that's what Sunset will be. We hope. We're going to be working on this game for a year, so it might change what happens, but we're very optimistic about our first attempt to tell a linear, strict narrative through the game. That's it. Thank you for coming. I hope it was okay. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, see ya.
Is that your happy ending?
Yeah, that's my happy ending.
Thank you.
So,
you spoke about how you kind of maybe gave up this attempt of yours to not have story in your games. What was did you find some kind of rule in the reactions people had when you, like you said, didn't have either the fun mechanics or the story? Like what was the kind of reaction you got from players when they didn't find either of those things?
Confusion. Confusion. I mean, and I think that previously I would have just said, this is in a way because of the conservatism of gamers, that they expect certain things, and if they don't get them, then it's just like, oh my God, what's going on? I'm so confused, rather than having the impulse to just explore and see what is there and try to appreciate it for what it is. But I think now I kind of have a different feeling that I kind of put that on us to a certain extent, and not, I mean, if anything, I've learned from Luxurious Superbia that we can get people to accept things that are odd, that are, that we can still consider it a success, that so many people have downloaded that game, a game that's so, you know, it doesn't have a story, it doesn't even really have a mechanic. However, it can feel like it does. I mean, it's like, I guess that's the subtle part of the subtle storytelling, you know, that, but we just don't want people to be so confused about our games anymore. I mean, we feel like, we want them to feel about our games like we feel about them, which is that they're very easy, and that it's not so scary or confusing, and they don't have to like freak out on the internet about it all the time, and yeah, so confusion.
Do you think do you think or hope that there's a cultural shift going on where people might become more accepting of these kinds of things, where the usual stuff isn't there? Where do you think there's some kind of at least hope of returning to a more experimental kind of gamer who's more willing to explore these kinds of things?
No, I'm not hopeful. Not anytime soon. I think I mean, this is kind of how it seems like to me. But to me, it seems like there's been a split between humans as a community, as a social group of people, and culture and civilization. It seems like there's a small group of people that is still involved with art and intellectual things, but they get smaller and smaller, and they get further and further away from what happens with people in general, sort of society in general. And I think, personally, I think that's actually why so many things are going wrong. And I think I don't see these things coming together. There's nobody who seems to want that, at least nobody who has enough power to do that. So our solution is sort of to sneak our way into this and maybe then we can pull it back at some point. It probably will be the next generation because it'll take, I mean, I see this as the history of modernist art. I mean, it started in the early 20th century, 100 years. It's been growing away actually from, and the role of art has been taken over in society to some extent by video games, but then sort of more like the popular video games. So that's where there is some hope, maybe. Cinema as well. There are a few popular art forms. But a sort of radical confrontation, I don't think is going to work. People don't have the patience anymore. The education, the context isn't there. I find that a pity, but
even within video games, I think.
Yeah, you have.
I don't know. Yeah.
You can see that in the sort of more deviating games that are successful now, like Stanley Parable or Gone Home or Dear Esther, things like that. You can clearly identify their roots in conventional games, and I think these are necessary. There needs to be some kind of thing that people feel comfortable with before you can give them something more. If you go too far, you lose the audience. And then, of course, as an artist, it's your choice whether you work for this small group of people who gets it or doesn't. I mean, that's an individual choice.
Ultimately, we feel like it's kind of a shame. Like, we feel like there needs to be more experimentation, not less, and that people should be supporting that experimentation, like radical experimentation in video games. I mean, there's just so many, if you let your mind go free and wander into what video games actually are, into what you're actually doing when you play a video game, there's just so many things that haven't been done yet. And we feel like if only there were a way to like economically support that would be really great. That's what indie games are supposed to be, but that's just not what they are right now. I don't know when that's gonna change, but I wish it would. Because we're such downers.
I was thinking myself, you were mentioning some just in a bit. You were mentioning some of these games. Would you say there are some other games? I mean, you do very different stuff from the mainstream stuff. Is there some other games you look for as inspiration, or do you mainly? I mean, you have lots of stories from outside.
No, we don't look to games for inspiration usually. No. There's not that we don't like some games, but it's just that they're not usually feeding what we're doing so much.
So you're a bit lonely in the scene, so to say.
We've always been lonely souls, yeah. I mean,
enough.
we support those games and we enjoy that they exist and stuff. But I think that, yeah, if you could take a look into our minds and be there when we're talking about this stuff, what we want our next projects to be or something like that, you'll find that our games are even stranger than like anything we've actually ever made. And that's kind of a burden we have to bear and a bullet we have to bite or whatever, and just make things that we know we can, that will communicate well with the audiences that we're trying to reach. And that takes a certain dose of reality for us to face also. We prefer to be just like some sort of like, I don't know, to be producing the things that we think should exist, like, I don't know. than sort of making things to sell them. You know what I mean? It's like, so it's not like we don't have fun making our games. It's more that we're sort of disappointed that we can't make what we want, which is kind of, again, selfish, right? So it's a big conundrum for us. We've thought about this a lot. Anyway.
Sorry, I don't know how to use these things. I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for an inspiring talk. This kind of validated a lot of what I've been feeling lately as a game designer.
Hey, cool. Thank you.
Less lonely.
Yeah, we're just a little bit less lonely. We've actually been feeling less lonely a lot lately. I think it's because in independent development, there have been a lot more different types of people getting involved in making games in these past few years. So we felt like indie games are a lot more welcoming. I don't know if this answers an earlier question a little bit better, but it's like we feel like there are a lot, even though we may not always feel inspired by the games that we play as such, we are inspired by our fellow developers a lot more in terms of who they are and what they're saying and how they're out there and how they're trying to do this thing that you were talking about to make the world safe for experimental art and games again. So in that sense, we are hopeful, and it's not all gloom and doom, I guess. But yeah, there's more questions.
Hi, I just wondered, you touched on the fact that you get a lot of your funding from the Arts Council in Belgium.
Yeah.
I just wondered, is there any other kind of funding for experimental things that you could share with us? Because I know that, you know, for experimental gameplay, it's very hard to try and find any kind of funding for it.
Yeah, and it's gotten worse, actually, as governments have gotten more conservative across Europe. But we did get funding from EU Media program once also, for prototyping even. I mean, so that was very lucky. We did a whole research phase for Luxurious Superbia and for a version of the first game we showed, 8. We're planning on doing a new version of that, and we had a whole research. We were able to do a whole design research sort of period with EU Media. But I would say that the problem with arts funding in general is that the budgets are tiny, teeny tiny, itty bitty little budgets. And so we wouldn't be able to do it if it was just that. So it's good that our games sell to the extent that they do, because now we're kind of 50-50-ish with paying for our own research and development, production, and arts funding. So yeah, but other than that, yeah, what have we done? We
had something funny with the Endless Forest. We were often invited as media artists to participate in exhibitions, but we always felt weird because we make software and it's not supposed to be in a space. So we had this thing that we said, okay, instead of us making a piece for your space, we'll just take your space and put it in our piece. So that's what we did with the Endless Forest. If there was a budget, we created something in our game for the players that they could then show in their exhibition, but that remained online for the players. So that's why the ruin is there. There's like a place where the animals can come to drink and magic happen. That was for another show. All inspired by sort of local elements in that. So that's another way that we funded things as well, rather creatively. Oh yeah, well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I recall that like few years ago you were saying that you were using Unity and doing like visual coding, and said something about that it's a good way if you are more into like the artistic thinking. So are you still using that, and can you tell me something about the actual work process and the techniques you're using?
Oh,
yeah, we're still using Unity. When the most important reason for it is that we can publish to different platforms. That's actually the most important reason. It has some handy features in terms of working with assets and all that. And there's also new add-ons now, and some of the most interesting ones for us are the ones that allow us to program visually, because the traditional way of programming in Unity is through scripting, and this just doesn't work so well for us. Like the Path and the Endless Forest were both programmed visually in an application called Quest 3D. So that means like little blocks, and you connect the little blocks together. It's like a flowchart. So there's more and more things like that for Unity, which is very nice for us to use. But other than that, we're sort of still hoping that some new technology will appear to make it easier for us and our weird artistic brains to sort of translate the logic that we have in our heads in a way that is more natural than having to learn machine languages, which is kind of difficult for us. But we do it, you know, suffer through it. Is there anything else specific you wanted to know about the technology?
No, just was
very
thinking
general.
some kind of like the workflow or maybe something about the actual design process or just in general.
Oh, very generally, we try to make the game as soon as possible. We sort of used to say we make the game first and then we design it, which means that even with a very sort of small idea, we just build the game world and we start interacting with it and get as much of our ideas out of that interaction, out of the prototype, basically. Because in our experience, the things that you think about before you start working are almost all wrong and they never work. And it's better to just make something and then experiment. And in a way, your game is always finished that way. You just keep polishing it and keep making it better. That's sort of a general process. With Sunset, it's a little bit different because it's narrative, and we have to write the story first. And there's a lot of structuring going on before we make it. But we already have a prototype there too, to sort of inform atmosphere and artistic decisions. But that's definitely, it's almost not prototyping. We start making the game, and and sometimes we make it again. But
I think that's the thing that's most inspiring for us is making, having an idea and then making some part of it concrete, like through the prototype, and then seeing what that world is, how that world feels to move around in, how the ideas that you've been tossing around in your head like actually play out as you interact with things in that world, and then that becomes like a really inspiring thing. Like all the like problems that occur, all the little glitches, all the things that are sort of unhappy accidents, even as you try to fix those things, you sort of learn a lot about the thing that you're making. And that leads, and also music, the musical aspect of it, the collaborations that we do. I mean, this also fits into the workflow. We try very early on to have anyone who's collaborating on the project to give us things for it, you know, and then we sort of feel like, you know, because we wanted to collaborate with these people for what they do, you know, we're never specifically giving them like very specific, rigid instructions on, we want you to make this. We're asking them how they interpret this thing that we're making, and then that sort of ends up being feeding into something new that we can put into the game. Something they may have given us an element that we were missing sometimes. You know, be that someone who's working with us for modeling and they're making characters or something, or if it's a musician or something, then suddenly we have their music or some part of their music that they wanted to make for the game, and we realize something about the game that we're making that we didn't know before. You know, or the subject of the game that we didn't know before. And so even with Sunset, even though it's like our story that we're telling from beginning to end, it's going to be informed, the atmosphere of it and even the interaction of it is going to be informed by the other people that we are collaborating with on the project.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any more questions or comments? Well, I think thank you once more.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye.
It was really interesting to hear kind of a run through all your different games. But yeah, we, as normal, we have a little coffee moment for those who want to still hang out for a while and maybe have a chat in that direction. So feel free to join, and thank you for all of you and those who have been listening on the internet. And yeah, next next lecture will be by research magician Stuart Nolan. I don't remember the exact name of his speech, but also sounds sounds very interesting. And there's actually also a workshop connected to the next lecture. So again, if somebody is interested, send me some email, miikka.junnila@aalto.fi. But thank you, and feel free to join for a coffee behind the corner. Thank you.